Liam was completely handcuffed, his breathing labored and his hands immobilized, as if the weight of destiny was already crushing his soul. He walked slowly through the cold courthouse corridors, his feet dragging across the marble floor, as if gravity itself wanted to hold him back. People's gazes were fixed on him, some expressions of judgment, others of pity, but in his heart there was something he couldn't understand: emptiness. The emptiness of being treated like a criminal, when in fact he barely grasped what was happening. Just 12 years old, and he was already there, being dragged into the room where his life would be decided. As the boy passed by, whispers spread like wildfire. "Did you see? The boy, the guilty one. Will he be sentenced to life in prison? He has the look of a monster, doesn't he?" But amidst all that murmuring, a sound cut through the air. It was a muffled cry, a profound pain that escaped his throat like a silent scream. Liam stopped for a moment, feeling the gazes even more intense, as if each one was evaluating the pain he felt, judging him for something he didn't even comprehend. He looked at the faces around him, but no face seemed friendly. No face seemed to understand the pain he carried, and that made him cry even more. Hot tears streamed down his cheeks, but he quickly wiped them away, trying to hide the weakness he felt, as if the tears were a sign of his guilt. The trial proceeded normally, with the prosecution presenting their version of the facts, and the defense attorneys attempting to rebut the accusations. The judge, an elderly man with a severe face, seemed bored and tired of the whole story, but remained steadfast, as if his authority was the only thing still holding him in that courtroom. Liam didn't fully understand what was happening around him. The words sounded like a distant buzzing in his ears, distant, unreal. He only knew they were trying to decide what to do with him, decide his fate, and he had no control over anything. Time passed in the courtroom, and many things happened. Things that will be told in due time during the story. And then, after so many events, something unexpected occurred. The judge, who until that moment had seemed unperturbed, suddenly raised his voice. "I can't take it anymore. I was the one who killed him," he shouted, his deep voice reverberating through the room, surprising everyone present. Liam looked at him, confused, unsure if he had heard correctly. The room fell into absolute silence. All eyes turned to the judge, as if expecting him to explain what he had just said. The judge seemed disturbed, his face pale and his hands trembling. Liam still couldn't understand. He had clearly heard what the judge said, but something didn't fit. The judge had been responsible for the death? Why was this happening now? He looked at the defense attorney, the prosecution, the jurors, all with expressions of disbelief. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The judge seemed to be having a nervous breakdown, his words coming out rushed and senseless. I can't hide it anymore," he whispered. "It was a mistake I can't correct." The room was in shock and no one knew what to do. The judge's words hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. What was he saying? What did he mean by that? Everyone was so absorbed in that moment that no one dared to interrupt. The case, which had seemed simple, with Liam being accused of a horrific crime, now took a disconcerting and mysterious turn. The boy, for his part, was lost. The judge's words echoed in his mind, but he couldn't understand what they meant. He didn't know what to do with that revelation. He didn't know what to expect. He was being accused of something he didn't understand. And now the very judge, the figure of authority who should be the foundation of justice, was confessing something so impactful. Fear took hold of Liam in a different way. It was no longer just the fear of the trial, but now he found himself trapped in something much bigger, more complex than he could ever imagine. Liam's defense attorney stood up quickly, trying to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor, what you're saying is inadmissible. You cannot make a statement of this gravity without presenting evidence or context." Despite the firm words, his voice betrayed his nervousness. The judge, however, seemed oblivious to the formalities and rules of the courtroom. His eyes were glazed over, fixed on a distant point, and his expression was taken over by a mixture of guilt and despair. I did it. I committed the act with my own hands, and now he's paying for something he never did." The confession sounded like a heavy echo, filling every corner of the room and leaving everyone present in absolute silence. Liam, still handcuffed, looked around confused and lost, not understanding how his life had reached this point. The courthouse, once a place of order, now seemed like a stage of impending chaos. The constrained, embarrassing silence that dominated the courtroom seemed to carry the weight of something greater than anyone there could comprehend. But to understand what had led Liam to that moment of despair, it would be necessary to go back in time, to the dark past he tried to forget. A past that was not only marked by physical pains, but by emotional scars that seemed endless. It was a past that began exactly 1 year before, when Liam was just a 6-year-old child. He was small with big, curious eyes, full of an innocence that life had not yet completely destroyed. Despite the circumstances, there was something in him that longed for love, for attention, for a simple gesture of affection that never came. Liam lived in an old house, with peeling walls and a constant air of abandonment. His days were solitary, marked by moments of silence intertwined with the shouts of his father, Daniel, a man whose presence was more frightening than comforting. At that time, Liam still believed that if he was good enough, he might be able to win his father's love. He tried everything. He organized his toys neatly, drew colorful figures and showed them with enthusiasm, and even tried to imitate the man's heavy steps around the house. But nothing worked. His father saw none of it. He only saw a burden, a child who for him was more of a responsibility than a joy. One morning, Liam woke up early, full of energy and with a simple, sweet idea in his head: to play with his dad. He grabbed an old ball which had already lost its color from so much use and ran down the stairs, ignoring the creaking wood under his feet. He found Daniel sitting at the table with an empty look and a bottle beside him. Liam smiled, holding the ball in his small hands and extending it. "Dad, do you want to play with me?" His voice was hopeful but hesitant, as if he already knew what the answer would be. The man looked at him, and for a brief moment, something like regret shone in his eyes. But it was just an instant. Soon he stood up, impatient, took the ball from Liam's hands and threw it against the wall with such force that it ricocheted, almost hitting the boy. "I don't have time for this, don't you understand? Get out of here and go to your place." Your place was the basement. That cramped, dark, rat-infested space had become a prison for Liam, a cruel form of punishment that his father used whenever he lost his patience. But before he could react, the man was already holding his arm tightly, dragging him down the stairs and ignoring his tearful protests. "Please, Dad, I didn't do anything wrong. I just wanted to play." Liam's words were cut off by the sound of the basement door being slammed shut and locked. The boy fell to the cold, damp floor, hearing his father's heavy footsteps walking away. He curled up in a corner, hugging his knees as he felt his eyes burn with tears. The basement was more than a physical space. For Liam, that place was the center of his nightmares, a territory that seemed alive, pulsating, filled with an oppressive darkness. The sounds that came from the damp corners, like the scurrying of rats, seemed like devilish laughter echoing in his mind, further fueling the terror he felt. The lack of light was total, suffocating, as if the darkness itself wanted to swallow him whole, erasing any trace of who he was. He barely breathed, afraid that even the sound of his breathing would draw the attention of something he didn't want to encounter. Liam curled his body into a corner, hugging his knees and trying to become invisible in a space that already isolated him completely from the world. During the day, silence was his only protection. Liam remained motionless, holding his breath whenever he heard any sound coming from above, fearing that his father would come down the stairs to yell at him or, worse, to throw him even deeper into that abyss of fear. He learned to be quiet, to ignore the hunger that burned in his stomach and the pains of the body that grew stiff from the cold. But the night was different. The night brought with it a kind of cruelty that seemed carefully planned. As if it wasn't enough to have him locked in that horrible space, Daniel became even more sadistic. The violent kicks on the door echoed through the basement walls like thunder, making Liam's heart race. He tried to cover his ears with his small hands, but the noise pierced everything, penetrating his mind and snatching away any remnant of courage he tried to muster. Each kick was like a declaration of hatred, as if his father was shouting wordlessly how much he despised Liam's existence. The boy felt the impact of the kicks, as if they were against him, not just the door. With each crash, he pressed his knees tighter against his chest, as if that could protect him from something that wasn't physical, but still deeply wounded him. Liam wanted to believe he could resist, that he could endure, but his will seemed to dissolve along with the sound of the vibrating wood. One night, As the kicks followed the same cruel pattern, Liam began to whisper to himself, "I won't cry. I won't cry. I'm strong." His voice was low, almost inaudible, but carried a desperate determination, as if he was trying to convince himself that he could overcome that terror. But the tears, treacherous, streamed down his face before he could contain them. They came silently, hot and endless, as he struggled not to completely fall apart. It was an uneven battle, and Liam knew it. He was just a child, small, fragile, facing something that seemed bigger than the world itself. What Liam could not understand at that time was that those endless nights were shaping something within him. Every kick at the door, every tear that fell, was planting invisible seeds of a strength he did not yet know he had. The constant pain was not only destructive, it was also creating in Liam an ability to endure, to withstand, to survive, even when all seemed lost. He did not comprehend that, despite all the suffering, something in him was being fortified. A silent resilience was being born amidst the muffled screams and the nocturnal terror. As the kicks continued, Liam repeated those words to himself as if they were a mantra, a promise he forced himself to keep. "I am strong. I am strong." And even though his hands trembled and his body was curled up in fear, somewhere within him, a small spark of resistance began to glow. That spark, so small it was barely perceptible, would be his salvation in the future, the foundation upon which he would build his strength to face everything that was yet to come. The following day dawned with the muffled sound of voices above the basement. Liam, still huddled in the dark corner, woke with a start at the sound of his father's heavy footsteps upstairs. He tried not to make a sound, but curiosity was inevitable. He pressed his ear against the aged wood of the floor, trying to understand what was happening. The voices were unfamiliar, and he realized his father was talking to someone else. "I can't take it anymore with him, you understand? He's just dead weight. Better get rid of him and make some money." The father's voice was heavy with contempt, with no attempt to disguise it. "If you want, you can take him tomorrow." It's already decided. Liam felt the air escape from his lungs as if he'd been struck. He knew his father didn't like him, but he never imagined he'd be capable of selling him as if he were a worthless object. Tears threatened to fall, but he held them back with force, fighting against the despair that was beginning to take over his small body. His mind, despite the confusion and fear, began to work in a single direction. He needed to escape before it was too late. As the day progressed, Liam remained in absolute silence, waiting for the right moment. The light coming through the small cracks in the basement was already starting to disappear when he finally found a spot that could be his chance to escape. It was a hole in the wall, hidden among old boxes and cobwebs, big enough for him to squeeze through. Liam's heart was racing as he dragged himself across the cold floor, trying not to make a sound that could alert his father. He put his head in the hole, feeling the smell of damp earth and freedom on the other side. With effort, he began to pull his thin body through the narrow opening. His hands scratched against the wood and stones, but he didn't care. All that mattered was escaping, getting out of that place that had imprisoned him for so long. He was almost on the other side when he heard the sound he feared most, heavy footsteps descending the basement stairs. "Thought you could escape, didn't you, you ungrateful little brat?" Daniel's voice was a mixture of fury and contempt. Before Liam could react, he felt a rough hand grab his leg, pulling him back into the dark. He screamed, trying to grab onto the edges of the hole, but it was useless. His father yanked him out of there with force, throwing him to the ground with an impact that made the boy see stars. "You think you can defy me?" the man shouted, his eyes full of rage. He pulled Liam up by the arm, dragging him up the stairs. "Since you like to run away so much, I'll give you something to do. Let's see if you'll have time for these stupid ideas." Liam was thrown to the kitchen floor, the smell of old grease and dirt invading his nostrils. Daniel pointed to a bucket of dirty water and a grimy rag. "You're going to clean the entire house, and it better be spotless. If I find a single stain, you'll wish you'd never left that basement." With no choice, Liam picked up the rag with trembling hands. The icy water trickled down his fingers as he began scrubbing the floor. Every movement was accompanied by his father's stern gaze, as if he was enjoying the boy's suffering. Liam, however, cleaned with determination, not because he wanted to please his father, but because he knew he needed to survive. He hadn't given up on escaping yet, But at that moment, the only thing he could do was wait for the right time. As he scrubbed the floor, the boy looked at the distorted reflection in the bucket of water. His face, so young, seemed aged by the weight of everything he had already endured. The marks of dirt on his cheeks mingled with the tears he tried to hide, forming a portrait of pain and resistance. Each movement he made with the rag was a silent struggle, as if he were trying to erase not only the dirt from the floor, but also the invisible scars that suffocated him from within. The reflection in the water was almost unrecognizable to him. Liam saw a boy there who should have been running outside, playing, laughing, but who instead was trapped in a world of cruelty and loneliness. Still, deep in his eyes, there was a spark that stubbornly shone, a glimmer of hope that he refused to let die, even in the face of so much suffering. Liam knew that no matter how hard his father tried to break him, he needed to keep fighting. It was this spark, small and fragile, that kept him standing, that made his heart beat stronger every time he thought of freedom. And as he cleaned, he promised himself that this would not be his life forever. It wouldn't be the basement, nor the screams, nor the kicks on the door that would define who he was. He would find a way to escape, a way to be free, to exist in a world where he could breathe without fear. He just needed time. Time to grow, to learn, to become stronger. Liam knew that as long as he had hope, his fate was not completely in his father's hands. And even there, kneeling on the cold floor, he cultivated within himself the strength that would one day take him far away from that hell. The sun was already setting when Liam finished cleaning the house. His small hands were reddened from the effort, and his arms ached as if carrying a weight greater than they could bear. When he finally set the bucket aside, he thought he could rest, but Daniel appeared with that stern look that made the boy's heart race. Without a word, the man extended his hand and handed his son an old bag, telling him to hurry up. They were going to the market. The boy didn't dare complain, even with his tired body, because he knew what would happen if he said something displeasing. The streets were a mixture of noise and silence for Liam. He heard the sounds of people talking, children playing in the distance, and every laugh seemed like a stab. It was a reminder of what he didn't have. Daniel walked ahead, his steps firm and quick, as if he was always in a hurry. Liam tried to keep up, but his short steps could barely maintain the pace. As they approached the market, the boy, in a burst that he himself didn't understand, mumbled something that had been stored in his heart. "I don't like you." His voice came out low, almost a whisper, but laden with a courage he didn't know he had. The father stopped suddenly, turning to face him with an expression that mixed surprise and irritation. Liam, frightened, continued, "I wish you were a good father like the fathers I see out there. I wish you were someone who loved me, who played with me, but you only know how to yell, hit, and lock me in the basement. I don't like you, and I'll never like you." His voice trembled, but he said it all before the courage drained away. Before the father could react, a lady who was nearby with a friendly expression and a soft tone of voice intervened in the conversation. It was Mary, an elderly woman who always frequented that market. "My boy, don't talk to your father like that. He's a good man. I know sometimes fathers can seem harsh, but it's because they want the best for us." She looked at Liam's father and smiled, as if trying to convince him too. "Appreciate what you have, boy. Having a present father is a blessing that many don't have." Liam felt a lump in his throat upon hearing those words. How could that lady say such a thing without knowing what happened behind the walls of the house? He looked at her but said nothing. Daniel, on the other hand, nodded his head as if confirming the lady's words. He grabbed the boy's arm tightly and, without saying anything else, pulled him into the market. The way back home was silent. The boy carried the heavy bags while the father walked ahead, ignoring the son's effort. Liam knew Daniel hadn't liked what he had said, and the tension in the air was palpable. As soon as they arrived, Daniel ordered him to leave the bags in the kitchen and followed him closely. Before the boy could even think of going upstairs, the father grabbed him by the arm and dragged him to the basement door. Liam's heart began to beat faster. He knew what that meant. The father's strong, rough hands pushed him down the stairs without ceremony. The sound of the door being locked behind him echoed like thunder. The darkness of the basement enveloped him, but his eyes were already used to it. He felt his way until he found a corner where he could sit. He was exhausted, but he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep anytime soon. While he was there, something caught his attention. It was an old notebook, with yellowed pages covered in notes. He didn't know whose it was, but it seemed important. Liam opened the notebook and began flipping through the pages. There was a list of names written in a crude handwriting. Next to some names there were monetary values and dates. Some names were crossed out, and this piqued the boy's curiosity. He kept flipping until he realized something terrible. Those crossed-out names belonged to people he knew had gone missing. His body froze. He didn't fully understand what that meant, but he knew it wasn't something good. His father was involved in something dangerous, something he couldn't comprehend, but that filled him with fear. He wondered what else that man was capable of doing. While Liam was lost in his thoughts trying to process the information, an unexpected sound made him jump in fright. It was a gunshot. The sound came from upstairs and echoed through the basement. Liam's heart raced and he clutched the notebook tightly. He didn't know what was happening up there, but fear took over every part of his body. He stood up, trembling, trying to understand whether he should do something or stay where he was. The possibilities ran through his mind, but none of them seemed safe. He knew that in his father's world, anything could happen, and that terrified him more than he could explain. Liam pulled the doorknob with all the strength his frail arms could muster, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked as always, a constant reminder that he had no control over his own freedom. "Dad! Dad, open the door!" His voice echoed in the basement, a desperate cry that he knew deep down would not be answered. The seconds felt like hours, and the silence on the other side of the door was more terrifying than any sound that could come. He pounded his small hands on the rough wood, hurting his fingers, but he didn't give up. "Please, Dad, I heard a gunshot. Dad, what's going on?" The lack of response made him feel a wave of panic growing, as if he were being swallowed by an invisible current. While he kept on shouting, Liam started to climb the stairs hurriedly, trying to push the door with his shoulder. It was a desperate and useless attempt, but he didn't know what else to do. Sweat trickled down his forehead as he forced his body against the wood, but all he managed to do was hurt himself even more. In a moment of carelessness, his foot slipped on a loose step and he fell backwards. The impact was violent, and his head hit the stone floor hard. The pain came like a crushing wave, followed by absolute silence. He tried to get up, but his vision blurred, and before he could react, the darkness enveloped him completely. When Liam opened his eyes, the basement was darker than before. The feeling of lost time left him confused. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious, but the throbbing pain in the back of his head made him realize it hadn't been short. He touched the injured spot and felt something wet. Blood. The boy's heart raced, but he tried to regain his composure. He was still locked in, and the gunshot he had heard before kept echoing in his mind. It was like a warning that wouldn't let him rest. "I need to get out of here," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling as much as his hands. With renewed determination, Liam got up slowly, holding onto the wall to avoid falling again. He went to the door once more, but this time, instead of shouting or banging, he tried something different. He looked around the basement, searching for something he could use to force the knob. He found a rusty piece of metal lying in a corner, probably part of some old equipment his father had left there. Carefully, he placed the piece of metal in the door crack and began to force it. The sound of metal scraping against wood made his teeth grind, but he kept going. His mind focused solely on getting out. After much effort, Liam felt the lock give way slightly. He pushed harder, until finally the door opened with a loud creak. The initial relief was quickly replaced by a chill down his spine. The hallway ahead was dark, lit only by the faint light coming from a distant lamp. The silence was eerie, so heavy it seemed to whisper secrets he didn't want to hear. With cautious steps, he climbed the rest of the stairs and entered the hallway. That's when he saw him. His father's body lay stretched out on the floor, motionless. There was a pool of blood slowly spreading around him, staining the floor with a dark red that seemed deeper under the dim light. Liam stopped, unable to move or even breathe. His eyes were fixed on the man who, despite all the cruelties, was still his father. The gunshot he had heard before made sense now, but that didn't diminish the shock of seeing that scene. He didn't know whether to approach or run. After a few moments that felt eternal, Liam took a hesitant step toward the body. His legs were trembling so much that he felt he could fall at any moment. When he was close enough to see his father's face, he realized his eyes were open but lifeless. It was an empty stare that made him shudder. The man he feared so much now seemed insignificant, a body without the strength that once terrified him. Liam felt a confused mixture of emotions: fear, relief, sadness, and something he couldn't name. "Dad." His voice came out as a whisper, almost inaudible. He reached out his hand but stopped halfway, lacking the courage to touch the body. The smell of blood was strong, almost suffocating, and he began to feel nauseous. He took a step back, trying to get the image out of his mind, but it seemed engraved in his eyes. He didn't know what to do. Liam wanted to run, to flee that house and never return, but his legs were paralyzed. He looked around as if expecting someone to show up and help him, but the house was completely silent. Liam then remembered the notebook he had found in the basement. Could that have something to do with what he was seeing now? Could someone have come to collect the debt that his father didn't pay? Or could the father himself have caused that somehow? The questions arose in his mind, but no answer seemed satisfactory. He wanted to believe that all of this was a nightmare, and that at any moment he would wake up back in the basement, no matter how frightening that place was. But the smell of blood and the sight of the dead body were too real to be a dream. After a few minutes, Liam began to move again, as if the overwhelming weight of fear and shock was slowly losing its grip on him. His muscles ached, and his legs trembled as if they were about to give way at any moment, but he knew he couldn't stay there. The silence of the house, previously broken only by the sound of the gunshot, now seemed more threatening than any noise. Every second that passed in the hallway increased his anguish, as if the house were alive, suffocating him with memories and shadows. He needed to leave, find somewhere he could breathe without smelling blood, or imagining his father's vacant eyes staring at him. Liam looked at the outstretched body once more, and the sight made his stomach churn. The idea of passing through there, so close to the man who had terrified him in life, and now seemed even more terrifying in death, filled him with dread. He felt as if the ground were about to collapse beneath his feet, but he tried to focus. He took a deep breath, although the air was heavy with blood and fear, making it difficult to bear. "You can do it, you just need to pass. Just need to pass and get out of here," he murmured to himself, repeating the words like a mantra to ward off despair. With slow and hesitant steps, Liam approached. Each movement seemed a greater challenge than the one before, and the distance between him and the door seemed to stretch like a nightmare. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather courage, but the metallic smell of blood lingered, reminding him of reality. When he finally took the first step to pass the body, he felt his legs weaken. He didn't look down, didn't want to see anything else, just focused all his energy on continuing to walk. As he passed the body, the emotional weight hit him like a wave. The knot in his stomach tightened so much that he thought he might vomit. He wanted to run, but his legs seemed made of lead. "Don't look back, just keep going, he whispered to himself, his lips trembling. Even without looking, he felt his father's presence, as if that man could get up at any moment and pull him back. But he continued, dragging his feet down the hallway towards the door. When he finally reached the front door, he realized it was unlocked, something that never happened. Daniel always locked all the doors, kept all the keys with him, as if control over the house were an extension of the control he had over Liam. The boy hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Was it a trap? Would he find upon opening the door that none of this was real? But then he felt the fresh air escaping through the cracks, and the promise of freedom propelled him into action. He turned the knob slowly, as if fearing that the mere sound of the door opening would undo his courage. When the door opened with a low creak, Liam felt the cold night wind hit his face. It was like a slap of reality, a reminder that he finally had a chance to escape. For a moment, he stood there, looking out at the world outside. The darkness of night seemed more welcoming than the darkness of the house, and the stars, even shy in the sky, seemed to offer some kind of solace. He took the first step outside and felt the cold ground beneath his bare feet. Each step he took was a small victory, a greater distance between him and everything that had happened in that house. He didn't look back, didn't dare. He didn't want to risk seeing the body again, or realizing that something was wrong, that perhaps the nightmare hadn't ended yet. He began to run, his bare feet crushing dry leaves and small stones along the way. But he didn't feel the pain. All he felt was the desire to go as far away from that place as possible. As he ran, Liam had no idea where he was going. The cold night wind cut his skin, but he didn't care. Each gust was a reminder that he was free, at least for now. But at the same time, the fear lingered, hovering like a shadow behind him. He knew that even far from the house, what had happened there would follow him, like an invisible scar that would never disappear. He thought of his father, of the last words he heard from that man, of the sound of the gunshot echoing in his mind. The questions tormented him. Who had fired the shot? Why? Liam stopped for a moment, panting, trying to catch his breath. He looked at the dark path ahead, and then up at the stars. "I'm free," he whispered, trying to convince himself. But deep down, he knew that freedom came at a price. He was just a boy, alone in a world that seemed vast and relentless. Still, there was something inside him, a small flame that still burned. It was hope, or perhaps just the determination to survive. No matter what it was, Liam decided he would keep running, because anywhere would be better than the hell he had left behind. Liam looked at his father's body one last time before trying to wake him up again. He didn't understand why his father wasn't moving. He still had hope, even if small, that all of this was a nightmare that would disappear when he opened his eyes. "Dad, please wake up. I promise I'll be good. You don't need to scold me, I'll do whatever you want, just wake up." His voice trembled as he held his father's arm, shaking it gently, but the body remained motionless, lifeless. Despair took over him, and tears began to stream down, falling in heavy drops on the wooden floor of the hallway. He realized he was alone and needed help. He looked around, trying to remember where his father used to leave his cell phone. Maybe he could call someone, a neighbor, the police, or anyone who would know what to do. Liam rummaged through drawers in the living room and kitchen, knocking objects over along the way, until he finally found the phone in the corner of the living room table. He pressed the button to unlock the screen, but there was a password. Luckily, he remembered seeing his father enter it a few times. It was his birthday. With trembling hands, he typed in the numbers, and the device finally unlocked. Drawing strength from a place he didn't know existed, he dialed the police number, his small, hesitant fingers pressing each key as if they were carrying the weight of the world. When the call was answered, his voice came out broken by sobs. "Please come quickly. My dad is on the floor. He's not waking up. There's blood everywhere." On the other end of the line, the attendant tried to calm him down, asking him to explain what had happened and to stay put until a patrol car arrived. But Liam, inexperienced in dealing with something so frightening, began to wander down the hallway, confused and lost. Then something caught his attention. A gun was lying on the floor, near his father's body. He didn't know where it had come from or how it had ended up there, but the sight of the object left him intrigued and scared at the same time. Curious and unsure of what he was doing, he bent down and picked it up. Liam had never held a gun before, and the weight of the object surprised him. He ran his fingers over the cold surface, trying to understand why it seemed so important. He didn't know that at that moment his fingerprints were being left there, marking him in a way that would change his life forever. Seconds after picking up the gun, he heard the sound of sirens in the distance. His heart raced, mixing fear with a strange sense of relief. He ran to the window and saw the red and blue lights illuminating the street. The police had arrived, as he had requested, but instead of feeling safe, he felt a wave of panic. He was still holding the gun, and looking at his small hands, he realized how wrong it looked. He tried to put it down quickly, but before he could, the officers came in through the open door. The scene the officers found was chaotic. A dead man in the hallway, blood spattered on the floor, and a boy with a gun in his hands. Liam looked up, confused, as two officers quickly approached, guns drawn. "Drop the gun! Now!" one of them shouted, his voice firm and full of authority. Liam froze, his hands shaking, not understanding why they were shouting at him. I just wanted to help. I found it on the floor." He tried to explain, but his voice came out weak, almost inaudible. He dropped the gun as they asked, but the look on the officers' faces said it was too late. The officers wasted no time in handcuffing him, ignoring his desperate attempts to explain what had happened. "I didn't do anything, I swear. My dad was on the floor and I just picked it up because... Liam couldn't finish his sentences. His mind was in a whirlwind, and he didn't know how to convince those adults that he was innocent. The handcuffs tightened around his wrists, and the feeling of being treated as guilty was more painful than anything he had ever felt before. He was taken out of the house as neighbors began to gather, curious to see what was happening. At the police station, Liam was placed in a small cold room where two officers began asking questions. They wanted to know what had happened, how his father had died, and, most importantly, why he was holding the gun. Each question seemed like an accusation, and Liam could barely answer. "I don't know, I just wanted to help. He was on the floor, and I didn't know what to do." But the more he tried to explain, the more suspicious the officers seemed. They didn't believe that such a small boy could be telling the truth. Later, one of the officers returned to the room with a report in his hands. He looked at Liam with a mixture of compassion and sternness. "We ran a test on the gun. Your fingerprints are on it. You held the gun, didn't you?" Liam nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, but I didn't know it was wrong. I just wanted to help my dad." His voice broke at the end, and he began to cry uncontrollably. But at that moment, the explanation seemed to no longer matter. The physical evidence was there, and Liam was now the prime suspect. The night seemed endless. Liam was put in a cell where he was alone, trying to understand how his life had turned upside down so quickly. He felt trapped not only by the cold walls of the cell, but also by the weight of the accusations he couldn't shake off. The words of the police officers echoed in his mind. "You held the gun too? Your fingerprints are on it." He knew he was not guilty, but everything seemed to be against him. With his eyes fixed on the ceiling, he whispered to himself, "I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything." The silence of the cell was oppressive, but deep down in his mind, Liam knew he would need to fight to prove his innocence. He was just a boy, alone against a system that seemed determined to blame him. And as the early morning hours wore on, he made a promise to himself. He wouldn't let this define his life. He would find a way to show the truth, even if no one believed him now. But for now, all he could do was wait and try not to be swallowed by fear and loneliness. The interrogation room was cold and lit by a single lamp hanging from the ceiling. Liam was sitting on a metal chair, handcuffs still on his small wrists. He looked at the table, avoiding the gaze of the two police officers standing before him. They were tall, with hard expressions, and seemed unable to see the boy as anything but a suspect. One of them, arms crossed, began the interrogation with a voice laden with distrust. "Liam, let's start again. Why did you kill your father?" The question was direct, blunt, and the boy quickly raised his eyes as if he had been struck by a punch. "I didn't kill my dad. I swear I didn't do anything. He was already on the floor when I saw him." Liam tried to keep his voice steady, but it came out choked with the sobs he was trying to repress. The second police officer leaned forward, tapping his fingers on the table as if trying to create even more pressure. "Then how do you explain your fingerprints on the gun, boy? You were holding the gun that killed your father. That's not a coincidence, you understand? We want the truth." Liam shook his head vigorously, feeling the tears burn his eyes. "I just picked it up because it was on the floor. I didn't know it was wrong. I just wanted to help." But the police officers didn't seem willing to listen. They continued, their voices getting louder and their questions more incisive. "Help? How exactly do you think holding the gun would help? That doesn't make sense, Liam. You were angry at him, weren't you? You said you didn't like him, that you wanted him to be a better father. That's true, isn't it?" The boy blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears, but the pressure was too much. He didn't know how to answer without his words being twisted. I just wanted him to be different. But I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything, please believe me." Liam was trembling, his hands gripping the handcuffs so tightly that his wrists began to hurt. The police officers exchanged a look, as if they had already decided he was guilty. Suddenly, the door of the room opened and a familiar voice filled the environment. "This is the boy?" Liam looked up and saw Mary entering, with the same stern look he remembered from the first time he saw her. She seemed completely at ease, as if she were there to resolve an obvious issue. The officers greeted her respectfully, indicating that her opinion would be important for the case. "Yes, it's him," replied one of the officers, pointing to Liam. "We want to hear his version. You said you've already had an encounter with him before, right?" Mary nodded, folding her arms as she analyzed the boy from top to bottom. Liam felt a knot in his stomach, remembering the occasion when she defended him by saying he should love his father. But now her tone was completely different. "This boy is dangerous," Mary began, her voice firm and full of conviction. "I saw him with his father, and he clearly did not respect him. When I heard him saying he didn't like his father, I realized there was something wrong. He's rebellious, and I'm not surprised he did something like this. Maybe he felt frustrated, irritated, and he ended up acting on impulse." Her words fell like a stone on Liam's shoulders. He widened his eyes, shaking his head in despair. "No, it's not true. I would never do that. I was just sad because... Liam stopped, feeling suffocated by tears. He couldn't believe that woman was saying such cruel things about him. The officers, on the other hand, seemed to consider Mary's words as solid evidence. "Interesting," commented one of them, jotting something down on a notepad. "Would you say then that he had motives to do this?" Mary didn't hesitate. "Yes, of course he did. He's young, but that doesn't mean he can't be dangerous. Rebellious children like him need limits, and from what I saw he had already crossed them all." Liam began to cry uncontrollably. He looked at the officers, then at Mary, trying to find a spark of compassion in her eyes. "Please, you have to believe me. I didn't do anything. My father he was tough on me, but I would never hurt him. I just wanted him to love me, that's all." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Mary shook her head in disapproval, while the officers exchanged glances that seemed to confirm their decision. Liam felt as if the ground was opening up beneath him, ready to swallow him. All he wanted was for someone to believe him, for someone to listen. But at that moment he realized he was completely alone. Liam didn't know exactly how much time had passed since he was taken by the police, but enough to feel that his life would never be the same. He was in some kind of shelter, with cold walls and suffocating silence. The look of people around carried judgment, as if everyone was certain of his guilt. He tried to hide in a corner, hugging his knees and wondering to himself where it all went wrong. There was no one to defend him, no one to believe that such a small boy could be innocent, and above all, the guilt he felt for holding that gun seemed to crush him. On a particularly quiet night, while everyone was asleep, Liam made a decision. He needed to get out of there. He needed to escape that place that seemed to only confirm what others thought of him. The weight of guilt, combined with the fear of being condemned for something he didn't do, drove him to escape. He waited until the guards were distracted and with silent steps found a side door that led to the street. With his heart racing, he crossed the exit and ran without looking back, feeling the fresh night air for the first time in days. The city was quiet, with only a few lights flickering in the distance. Liam had nowhere to go, but he knew exactly who could help him. His Aunt Maria, Daniel's sister, had always been kind to him on occasional visits. She had a warm laugh and a look that conveyed security. He remembered a day when she hugged him tightly after an argument between her and his father. It was as if, at that moment, she knew what he was going through, even without saying anything. With this thought, he began to walk down the dark streets, guided by the memory of his aunt's address. His bare feet hurt with every step, but he didn't stop. He needed to get there. He needed someone who would listen to his version of the story, who would believe him. With each block, Liam looked back, afraid that someone was following him. The feeling of being guilty seemed to be ingrained in his skin, as if the whole world knew what he was carrying. When he finally reached Maria's house, he felt his heart pounding. The iron gate was locked, but he managed to climb over it with difficulty. Arriving at the door, he knocked hard, praying that she was home. Time seemed to drag as he waited. Finally, the door opened, revealing Maria's figure, still wearing a robe and an expression of surprise. "Liam?" she asked, adjusting her glasses as she tried to understand what she was seeing. "What are you doing here at this hour? You ran away?" There was concern in her voice, but something else too, something Liam couldn't identify. He took a step forward, his eyes filled with tears. "Aunt Maria, please help me. I didn't do anything. I swear, I just need someone to believe me." But before he could say anything else, his aunt's expression changed. Her face hardened, and she took a step back, as if she was afraid of him. "Liam, I don't know what you're thinking, but I heard what happened. Everyone is talking about it. You killed your father, didn't you? You're a murderer." Her words were like knives in the boy's heart. "No, it's not true," Liam cried, feeling the tears streaming down his face. "I didn't do anything. I was just there. I just picked up the gun because it was on the floor. Please, Aunt, you have to believe me." He reached out his hands to her, but Anna shook her head, backing away even further. "You need to leave, Liam. I can't help someone who did that. Please go before I have to call the police." Liam felt the ground disappear from under his feet. The last person he thought he could trust now saw him as a monster. He took a few steps back, unable to speak, as Anna's gaze shattered him. I just wanted someone to help me," he murmured, almost inaudible. With no other choice, he turned and began to run, feeling the tears fall harder. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he needed to get out of there, that he needed to escape from yet another rejection. As he ran through the dark streets, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, a pain that seemed greater than he could bear. The city seemed like a maze of shadows, and every corner brought a new wave of fear. Liam didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he was alone. And as he continued running, his aunt's words echoed in his mind, a cruel reminder that no one believed him. Murderer. The word seemed to haunt his steps, as if it were etched into his soul. He wanted to scream, he wanted to disappear, but all he could do was keep running, hoping that somewhere he could find peace. Liam was exhausted, his legs trembling with every step and his stomach aching with hunger. Since leaving his aunt's house, he hadn't been able to get anything to eat or drink. The streets seemed colder and more hostile with every minute that passed. His clothes were dirty, and he knew his face must have been marked by dust and tears. Liam stopped in front of a small restaurant, where the smell of hot food made the knot in his stomach even tighter. For a few moments, he hesitated. He knew his appearance wasn't the best, and many people might judge him without even hearing his story. But hunger was greater than fear. He went in slowly, looking at the floor, avoiding meeting the gazes of the customers seated at the tables. Behind the counter, a woman with her hair tied in a bun observed him curiously. She seemed to be washing dishes when she noticed the boy's presence. "What do you want here, boy?" she asked, without hostility, but also without much sympathy. Liam raised his head just enough for the woman to hear his voice. I just wanted some food. I don't have money, but I'm really hungry." He tried to sound firm, but his voice trembled, betraying the mixture of fear and despair he felt. The woman analyzed him for a few seconds, crossing her arms. She could see that the boy was not just another beggar, but something in his gaze seemed loaded with pain. With a sigh, she dropped the dishes she was washing and grabbed a plate from the counter. "Sit over there," she said, pointing to a table near the door. "I'll bring you something." Liam did as she told him, feeling his heart beat faster, this time with relief. He didn't know if it was kindness or pity, but it didn't matter. Finally, he would have something to eat. While she prepared the plate, Liam looked around, noticing that some people at the tables were staring at him with suspicious expressions. He tried not to be bothered, focusing on the smell of food coming from the kitchen. When the woman returned with a plate of rice, beans, and a piece of meat, his eyes lit up. "Here, eat quickly," she said, putting the plate on the table. "And then leave before someone complains." Liam nodded, murmuring a thank you as he began to eat voraciously. However, the calm didn't last long. Before he could take the third forkful, a man sitting at one of the nearby tables abruptly stood up, pointing his finger at him. "Hey, I know that boy." The man's voice was loud and filled with anger, enough to draw everyone's attention in the restaurant. Liam stopped eating, feeling his face grow hot. He knew something bad was about to happen. "That's the boy who killed his own father," the man continued, approaching the table where Liam was sitting. "I saw it on TV. This kid is a murderer." The woman who had served the food turned pale. She looked at Liam as if she had only just realized who he was. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice full of disbelief and revulsion. Liam tried to answer, but the words didn't come out. He opened his mouth, but he could only babble something incomprehensible. Before he could explain himself, the woman grabbed the plate he was eating from and threw it on the floor, making the food spread out. "Murderer!" she screamed, grabbing a broom leaning against the wall. "You don't even deserve that. Get out of here before I call the police." Liam stood up quickly, feeling tears burn his eyes. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, trying to calm the situation. But the look of hatred on the faces around him made him realize there was nothing he could do. The woman advanced with the broom and he instinctively took a few steps back. "Please, I didn't do anything. I'm not a murderer," he shouted, but his words were drowned out by the accusations and shouts around him. When the woman raised the broom, he didn't wait to see what would happen. He turned and ran out of the restaurant, feeling his heart beat so fast it felt like it would explode. He heard the woman shout something as he left, but he couldn't make out the words. All he knew was that he needed to get away from there as fast as possible. Liam ran through the dark streets, not knowing where he was going. Tears streamed down his face, mingling with sweat. Each step seemed heavier, as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He couldn't understand why no one believed him, why everyone seemed so willing to hate him without even hearing his side of the story. Finally, after a few minutes, he stopped in a narrow alley to catch his breath. He leaned against the cold wall, trying to control his breathing. The silence around him was oppressive, but for the first time since he entered the restaurant, he felt safe, if only for a brief moment. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the ground, hugging his knees and burying his face in his hands. Liam didn't know what he would do next. He was tired of running, tired of being treated like a monster for something he didn't do. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't give up. He needed to find a way to prove his innocence, to show the world that he wasn't the murderer everyone said he was. But how could he do that? He was just a boy, alone, and with no one to trust. As he sat there, lost in thought, a single question echoed in his mind. Why is this happening to me? He had no answers, only the desperate desire for all of this to be a nightmare he could wake up from. But as he looked at the shadows around him, he knew the reality was far worse, and yet he had to keep fighting. Liam walked aimlessly through the dark streets, the weight of hunger and fatigue making him slower with every step. Everything around him seemed distant, as if the world had decided to ignore him completely. It was then that he heard a sound that made him stop. It was a low, broken cry, coming from a dimly lit corner of the square. Approaching cautiously, Liam found a boy, perhaps a little younger than him, sitting on the ground with his face buried in his hands. Liam hesitated for a moment. He knew what it was like to feel alone, abandoned, and afraid, but he didn't know if the boy would accept his help. Still, he approached slowly and crouched down beside him. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. The boy looked up, his eyes swollen from crying, and shook his head. "No. My mom, she died today," the boy said, sobbing. Liam felt a pang in his chest. He didn't know exactly what to say, but he knew he had to try something. "I'm so sorry," he said, placing a hesitant hand on the boy's shoulder. "I know it must hurt a lot right now, but your mom would never want you to feel this way forever. She would want you to be strong, for her." The boy sniffed, looking at Liam with tear-filled eyes. "But I can't. She was all I had." Liam swallowed hard. He knew what it was like to lose everything, to bear a pain that seemed too big to endure. "I know it's hard," he replied, his voice trembling a little. "But you'll never forget your mom. She'll always be with you right here." He pointed to the boy's chest. The two were silent for a while, just breathing the same heavy night air. Finally, the boy spoke, his voice still weak. "Can you come with me to the cemetery? I want to say goodbye to her." Liam felt a chill down his spine. The idea of going to the cemetery made him uncomfortable, bringing back memories of his own loss and the accusations he now carried. But he couldn't say no. The boy needed him, and Liam knew what it was like to have no one. They walked together through the streets, the silence filled only by the sound of small, hesitant steps. When they reached the cemetery, the place seemed even darker under the pale moonlight. The boy held Liam's hand, squeezing it tightly as they walked among the gravestones. They stopped in front of a fresh grave, where fresh flowers had been left. The boy began to cry again, and Liam, not knowing what else to do, stood by him, offering his presence as comfort. After a while, Liam spoke. "I know it seems impossible now, but your mother will never really leave you. Whenever you think of her, whenever you remember something she said or did, she'll be there with you no matter what happens. Never stop remembering her." The boy looked at Liam, his eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. Suddenly, the sound of sirens broke the silence. Liam felt his heart race. He looked around, trying to understand what was happening, but then he saw the red and blue lights reflecting off the gravestones. Police officers were quickly approaching, and he knew they were there for him. "It's him!" one of the officers shouted, pointing directly at Liam. The boy looked at Liam, confused. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice full of fear. Liam didn't know how to answer. He took a step back, but the officers were already too close. "Hands up," they ordered, guns drawn. Liam raised his hands, his face gripped by panic. "I didn't do anything," he shouted, his voice full of desperation. The officers grabbed him forcefully, handcuffing his hands behind his back. The boy watched it all, paralyzed, not understanding why they were taking Liam away. "You killed your dad, boy. Don't think you'll get away with it," one of the officers said as he pushed Liam toward the squad car. Liam looked at the boy, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I didn't do it, I swear," he shouted as he was taken away. The boy stood there, tears streaming again. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. Liam, who had been so kind, so understanding, was now being taken away as a criminal. The image of him being dragged away by the police was burned into the boy's mind, leaving him more confused and lost than before. Liam was taken to the police station in handcuffs, his shoulders slumped and his gaze lost. Fear consumed him from within, but he tried to keep his composure. With every step he took, the sound of chains on the handcuffs echoed through the corridors. He was pushed into a cold room where a stern-looking officer awaited him. "You know why you're here, boy?" the man asked, his voice unrelenting. Liam couldn't answer. The words got lost in his throat, muffled by the terror that spread through his chest. "You're being charged with killing your father," the officer continued, his voice cutting. "Your trial will be in 3 days. If you're found guilty, the sentence is death. Do you understand?" That statement fell on him like a stone. The air seemed to disappear, and he swallowed hard, trying to process what he had just heard. I didn't kill my father," he managed to mumble, but his voice sounded so weak that he doubted his own words. The officer, however, didn't seem interested in explanations. "That doesn't matter now. You'll face the court in 3 days, said the officer, getting up and leaving the room. Liam was left alone, the weight of the situation crushing him with every breath. He was led to a cold cell where he sat on the floor, his head in his hands. What had happened to his life? How had he ended up in this place, being treated like a monster? Every thought was more confusing than the last, and he couldn't understand how it had all come to this. He tried to sleep, but fear kept him awake, thoughts tumbling over one another as minutes dragged like hours. The 3rd day came slowly, bringing with it the weight of the trial. Liam was taken out of his cell and back into the outside world. He was placed in a squad car, which took him to the courthouse. The journey seemed endless, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led to his own condemnation. When he arrived at the courthouse, the environment enveloped him oppressively. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridors, and people's glances pursued him, judging him without even knowing what had happened. At the moment he entered the courtroom, silence was absolute. Everyone in the room observed him, and Liam felt the weight of every gaze upon him. He was placed on the defendant's bench, where he remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the ground, trying not to care about the whispers circulating around the room. The trial began, and the prosecuting attorney wasted no time in painting Liam as a troubled youth, incapable of feeling remorse. The defense attorney, despite his attempts, seemed to be fighting against a sea of evidence and accusations, and Liam felt smaller and more powerless. The court seemed to have decided he was guilty even before the trial began. People's eyes were full of fear and disdain, and every word spoken in the room made his heart tighten. He wanted to scream, wanted to explain that he had done nothing, that he was not a murderer, but his voice seemed stuck, and fear was swallowing him from the inside. He tried to concentrate, but the words of the prosecuting attorney continued to echo in his mind, repeating that he was responsible for his father's death. Suddenly, a sound interrupted the rhythm of the trial. An unexpected loud and sharp scream echoed through the room, making everyone turn to the source of the sound. Liam froze, not understanding what was happening. The scream was loaded with emotion, a mixture of despair and disbelief, but no one knew who had uttered it. The room was in a tense silence, and Liam, with his heart pounding, tried to understand what was happening. The judge banged his gavel to restore order, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. The mystery of that scream hung in the air, leaving everyone uneasy. Liam didn't know what it meant for him, but a strange feeling began to form inside him. He felt a slight tremor, as if something was about to change, something he couldn't identify. The court resumed, but the words began to lose their meaning for Liam. He looked around trying to find out where that scream came from, and for a moment he forgot about his own trial. The air was charged with tension, and something seemed about to happen, but he didn't know what. The looks of the people were now different, filled with doubt, as if that single interruption had generated an uncertain doubt about his guilt. As the trial proceeded, Liam felt an immense weight in his chest, a feeling that something was about to happen, but he didn't know what. The room seemed to spin around him, and he couldn't focus on anything but the sound of his own heart beating faster. He didn't know how it would all end, but the mystery of the scream continued to echo in his mind. The courtroom was in a dense silence, as if the air had stopped moving. Liam, still nervous, tried to process what was happening around him. The judge was about to resume the hearing when, suddenly, a woman stood up from the middle of the room. Her eyes were wide with anger, and her voice echoed through the courtroom, cutting the air like a sharp blade. "That boy also killed my son!" she screamed, pointing at Liam, who was silent, shocked by the accusation. The whole room turned to look at her, their expressions mixing surprise and disbelief. Liam could barely understand her words, but their weight was undeniable. The woman continued to scream, saying that when they were children, she had seen Liam playing with her son, and that somehow he would have been responsible for his death years ago. The accusation seemed absurd, but the way she spoke made the audience doubt. It was as if she had found a way to link the past to the present, creating an invisible thread of guilt that stretched between the two. Liam wanted to speak, wanted to explain, but his throat seemed closed as if the words couldn't come out. The woman's words seemed to drag like a heavy shadow covering the room. The murmurs began to increase. People whispered to each other, trying to understand how it made sense, or rather, trying to find an explanation for that sudden accusation. Liam felt his breathing getting shorter, his chest tightening, as if he were being swallowed by that sea of voices. He looked at the judge, looking for some sign that he understood that woman was lying, but the judge was focused on taking notes on paper, as if that were just another piece of the puzzle. There was no compassion in his gaze. The room was about to descend into complete chaos when one of the police officers holding Liam pushed him hard, as if wanting to prevent him from reacting in any way. The officer, visibly irritated by the situation, took a step forward, his eyes narrowing in anger. Liam, his eyes filled with tears, had no strength to defend himself or even react. He felt like a cornered animal with no way out, no one to believe him. Without any warning, the officer raised his hand and slapped Liam violently across the face. The sound of the impact echoed through the room, cutting the air, and Liam felt his face burning, the pain spreading like fire. For an instant, everything fell silent. Liam was paralyzed, with the feeling that the world had stopped. The blow had stunned him, but the humiliation was even worse. He felt small, vulnerable, exposed there before everyone. The heat of the slap was still pulsing on his face, but what consumed him most was the look of contempt that the officer was directing at him. It was as if Liam was a thing, something insignificant, an object that could be despised without any remorse. The boy could not believe the violence he had just suffered. He never imagined that something like this would happen to him, and the impact of the blow made him feel even more distant from any dignity. The officer observed Liam with cold and relentless eyes, without any sign of regret. He seemed to have already distanced himself from what he had just done, as if he were dealing with a simple case, a mere formality in his workday. But for Liam, that violence was much more than just a slap. It was a symbol of everything he had already experienced, proof that no one believed him, a confirmation that he was treated as guilty even before any trial. The physical pain was intense, but the emotional pain was unbearable. He no longer knew who he was or where he should go. What he felt was a deep void, a dark hole that seemed to swallow his soul. The room was tense, but no one dared to interrupt. The woman's scream, the false accusation that still reverberated in Liam's mind, seemed even more insane after the slap. Liam tried to recompose himself, but the tears continued to flow without him being able to control them. His vision was blurred, and he could no longer look at anyone. He could not even move, as if the weight of what had just happened had left him without strength. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating, and the glances around were a mixture of pity and judgment. Liam could no longer distinguish what was real and what was an illusion created by his own tormented and hurt mind. The officer who had slapped him moved away a little, But Liam could no longer concentrate on him. Everything around him became a blur. The noise of the room seemed to disappear, and he felt as if he were being swallowed by an abyss. What he feared most, the loss of dignity, was now consummated. The boy who once dreamed of freedom and justice was now trapped in a cruel and relentless reality where there was no more room for dreams or hopes. He felt a wave of despair and helplessness, and all he wanted was to disappear, to vanish from that place. The impact of the slap echoed in his mind, and he felt completely disoriented. Liam wanted to scream, wanted to explode in anger, but fear paralyzed him. He knew that his voice had no power there. No word of his would be enough to change people's perception, to change the way he was seen. He was completely lost, in a place where the truth no longer mattered. The slap was not just a physical assault. It was a direct blow to his soul, proof that he was completely alone in that world, that no one was willing to fight for him. The courtroom was plunged into a whirlwind of murmurs. Some said that the slap given to the boy was deserved, claiming that he needed to understand the weight of his actions, while others claimed that this was an unjustified violence against a child. The judge, with a hardened countenance, raised the gavel and struck it forcefully on the table. "Silence in this room," he ordered, his voice cutting through the noise. "I will not allow this hearing to turn into chaos." This is a courtroom, not a public square. The judge's eyes fixed on the police officer, laden with disapproval. "You have dishonored the uniform you wear. Your behavior was deplorable and will not be tolerated here. You are dismissed from this hearing. Leave now before I take even more severe measures." The officer hesitated, his fists clenched in anger, but ultimately yielded to the judge's authority. Without a word, he turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing in the heavy silence that settled. Liam remained in his chair, head bowed and eyes red from tears that insisted on falling. He felt everyone's gaze upon him, a silent judgment that seemed crueler than words. The judge took a deep breath and addressed the boy. "Liam, this hearing is for you to have the opportunity to present your defense. Now that we have regained order, I want you to explain in your own words what happened that night." Liam raised his head slowly, his voice trembling when he finally answered, "I didn't do anything. I would never hurt anyone, let alone my father, no matter how he didn't treat me well." He paused, his throat tight. "He would lock me in the basement, yell at me, tell me I was a burden. But I didn't kill him." The murmurs returned to the courtroom, quieter but equally intense. A woman at the back of the court whispered to the person next to her, "He's lying. How could someone do that to their own child? It's impossible." Another voice countered, "But what if it's true? What if that man really treated him like that?" The judge raised his hand, imposing silence once again. "Let's stay focused. Liam, you claim you were mistreated, but there is no evidence to confirm that. Do you have anything else to say in your defense?" Liam took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage to continue. "No one knows what it was like in there. He said he loved me, but it was only in front of others. When we were alone, he called me useless. I would be in the dark for hours, listening to the rats. And still, I would never hurt him." Once again, the room filled with whispered voices, some laden with disbelief, others with shock. The judge leaned forward, his expression hardened. "Liam, the court needs evidence, not just words. Your version of events is serious but also accusatory. So far, the evidence points to you as responsible for the crime. What do you have to say about that?" Liam clenched his fists, tears streaming down his face. "I'm not a murderer. I just wanted him to leave me alone. But I would never do something so horrible. Please believe me." The courtroom seemed like a pressure cooker about to explode. Every corner of the room was filled with muffled murmurs, heated debates, and expressions of pure judgment. The crowd appeared divided between those demanding harsh justice and those who could barely look at the frail boy sitting in the defendant's box, as if his presence was a cruel reminder of all that is wrong with the world. The prosecutor rose with firm steps and a relentless expression, the kind of look that made even the strongest hesitate. He adjusted his tie with surgical precision and began to speak in a voice as cold as a biting winter wind. "Your Honor, this case must not be treated lightly. We are dealing with a barbaric, premeditated, and cruel crime. This boy, despite his frail appearance, took the life of his own father. A man who, according to the evidence and testimonies, was an exemplary citizen and a devoted father. This court has a duty to protect society, and that begins by ensuring that people like him are properly punished. The murmurs grew more intense, as if the prosecutor's words were a match thrown onto a pile of dry hay. Liam, in the defendant's box, could not raise his eyes. He felt the weight of each accusation, as if each word were a stone thrown in his direction. His hands were visibly trembling, but he gripped them tightly in his lap, trying to cling to the little dignity he had left. The prosecutor continued, his voice growing even firmer as he pointed at the judge with an almost theatrical gesture. "Therefore, Your Honor, in the name of justice and public safety, I request that this defendant be sentenced to death. The electric chair is the only just punishment for a crime as heinous as this." The silence that followed was overwhelming. For a moment, it seemed that even the air had been sucked out of the courtroom, leaving only the palpable tension between its walls. Liam felt his stomach churn. Death penalty. He could barely comprehend the gravity of those words, but he knew they meant the end. He knew that to those people, he was already condemned long before he entered that room. His eyes welled up, and he swallowed hard, desperately trying not to give in to panic. The judge, with a stern expression, leaned forward and looked directly at Liam, as if trying to see something beyond what others saw. His voice, when he finally broke the silence, was low but carried an authority that did not allow questioning. "Liam, you have heard the charges. This court is about to make a decision, but before that, you have the right to speak. And if you have anything to say in your defense." Liam opened his mouth to answer, but the words seemed to flee. He wanted to shout that he was innocent, that he had done none of that, but he felt paralyzed by fear and the overwhelming pressure of that room full of judging eyes. After a few seconds of torturous silence, he finally managed to mumble, I didn't do it, please believe me. I would never do that." His voice was so fragile that it seemed about to break, and tears began to stream down his face, betraying his attempt to maintain composure. But before the judge could proceed, the courtroom door opened with a loud creak, drawing everyone's attention. The sound echoed through the room like thunder, breaking the suffocating atmosphere. A boy entered, hesitant, but with a determined expression that contrasted with his shy posture. He was young, barely past 10 years old, and his eyes were red and swollen, as if he had cried a lot before gathering the courage to be there. Liam recognized the boy immediately. It was Matteo, the boy he had met in the cemetery. Matteo walked slowly to the center of the room, ignoring the looks of curiosity and disbelief that followed him. He seemed small and vulnerable before the crowd, but there was something in his posture that conveyed a silent strength. The judge, surprised by the interruption, frowned and asked, his voice laden with authority, "Who are you and what are you doing here? This is a court of justice, not a place for interruptions." Matteo swallowed hard, but did not back down. His voice, though trembling at first, carried a conviction that was impossible to ignore. "My name is Matteo, Your Honor. I'm here to speak about Liam. I know they're saying horrible things about him, but I need to tell what he did for me." He glanced briefly at Liam, who was sitting in the defendant's bench with his eyes wide with surprise. The silence in the room became almost deafening. Everyone was attentive, curious to hear what that boy had to say. Matteo took a deep breath and began to tell his story, his voice gaining strength with every word. "I was in the cemetery, crying because my mother had just died. I was alone, lost, with no one to help me. That's when Liam appeared. He didn't know me, but he still stayed there with me. He told me I wasn't alone, that my mother would still be with me, even though I couldn't see her. He held my hand and stayed there until I stopped crying. He gave me strength when I needed it most, without asking for anything in return." Matteo's words seemed to pierce the heart of everyone present in the room. Some began to look away, ashamed to have judged Liam so harshly without even knowing his story. The judge, who had until then maintained a stern expression, began to blink rapidly, as if trying to hold back tears. He took a handkerchief and discreetly wiped his eyes, but the gesture did not go unnoticed. Matteo continued, now with a firmer voice. "I know they're saying he's a monster, but that's not true. No one who does what he did for me can be a bad person. I don't know what happened with his father, but I know he's not a murderer. He's good, he deserves a chance. The prosecutor, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the hearing was taking, tried to intervene. "Your Honor, this testimony, although moving, is not relevant to the case at hand. We are here to judge a crime, not isolated acts of kindness." But the judge raised his hand, silencing the prosecutor with a gesture. "I decide what is relevant or not in this court, prosecutor. And at the moment, I think we all need to hear what this boy has to say." He turned to Mateo, his voice softer this time. "You were very brave to come here today, boy. Your story is important, and it will be taken into consideration." Mateo nodded but remained in the center of the room, as if refusing to leave while Liam's fate was still at stake. The courtroom was quieter than ever, but the silence was now not just tension. It was a silence laden with reflection, doubt, and perhaps a spark of hope. Liam, who was in the defendant's bench, felt a wave of emotions so intense that he could barely breathe. For the first time, he did not feel completely alone. There was someone there, someone who believed in him, who was willing to speak for him when he himself could not find the words. He looked at Mateo with tears in his eyes, but this time, they were not just of despair, they were of gratitude. The tension in the courtroom seemed to have reached a breaking point. As Mateo remained standing in the center of the room, his breathing began to grow heavy. He tried to remain firm, but his legs were visibly trembling, as if the weight of everything he was doing was draining his strength. Liam, still in the defendant's bench, noticed the boy's suffering and tried to get up, but the officer beside him pushed him back with a rude gesture, as if his concern was an insult. Mateo, now visibly pale, put his hand to his chest, gasping. He tried to say something, but his words were swallowed by a low moan before his legs gave way completely. The sound of Mateo's body hitting the floor echoed through the room like thunder, interrupting any whisper that still remained. The crowd gasped in unison, and some people rose from their seats shocked by the scene. The judge, who until then had maintained a firm posture, leaned forward with wide eyes. "Call an ambulance immediately," he ordered, his voice trembling slightly with the gravity of the situation. The prosecutor, who had seemed untouchable until then, looked at the fallen boy with a mixture of guilt and discomfort. Liam tried again to get up, his voice now filled with despair. "Let me help, he needs me, please, he can't die." But before he could take a step, the officer beside him pushed him back harder, nearly causing him to lose his balance. "Stay in your place, murderer. You're not going anywhere." The anger in the officer's voice was clear, and as if that wasn't enough, he kicked Liam's leg hard, causing him to groan in pain and fall to his knees. The act caused an immediate uproar. Some people in the audience shouted in protest, while others looked at the officer with evident disapproval. "That's unnecessary," someone exclaimed, but the officer didn't even look away from Liam. He was clearly irritated, and his heavy breathing showed how much he was letting his emotions take over. The judge banged his gavel forcefully on the desk, trying to regain control of the room. "Enough! This is a court of justice, not a spectacle of violence." Meanwhile, Mateo remained on the floor motionless, with a weak and irregular breathing. A man in the audience, probably a doctor, ran to the boy's side and checked his pulse. His expression grew serious, and he turned to the judge with urgency. "He's very weak, almost unconscious. If the ambulance doesn't arrive soon, it may be too late." The doctor's words spread a chill throughout the room, and several people began to murmur with concern. Liam watched the scene with a heavy heart, feeling powerless in the face of the situation. He knew that Mateo had risked everything to defend him, and now the boy was paying the price. Tears began to stream down Liam's face, but he didn't try to hide them. "Please, don't let him die," he pleaded, looking desperately at the judge. "He's only here because of me. He did this for me. Let me help him, I beg you." The judge, clearly shaken, hesitated for a moment before responding. He looked at Liam with an expression that wavered between doubt and empathy. But before he could say something, the sound of sirens in the distance announced the arrival of the ambulance. The tension in the room eased slightly, but the sense of urgency still hung over everyone. The doctor remained by Mateo's side, trying to keep him stable until the rescue team entered the courtroom. The paramedics arrived within seconds, moving quickly to the boy. They carefully placed him on a stretcher, while one of them checked his vital signs and put an oxygen mask over his face. "He's severely dehydrated and showing signs of hypoglycemia. We need to take him to the hospital now." said one of the rescuers, already starting to push the stretcher toward the exit. Liam tried again to get up, his voice filled with despair and anguish. "I need to go with him. Please let me go. He's like this because of me. He only came here for me." This time his words seemed to strike something in the judge, who watched him with an expression of internal conflict. The prosecutor, however, was quick to oppose. "Your Honor, this is an outrage. This defendant is in custody and cannot simply leave the courtroom." The judge banged his gavel again, silencing the prosecutor. "This court will decide what is appropriate or not, prosecutor." He turned to the officer beside Liam, his voice now firm and authoritative. "Release him. I will not allow this court to be seen as insensitive to human suffering." The officer hesitated for a moment, but the judge's gaze left no room for discussion. Reluctantly, he stepped back, allowing Liam to get up. Liam staggered, still feeling the pain from the kick to his leg, but he didn't care. He began walking toward the exit, but the officer grabbed his arm forcefully, preventing him from going any further. "I'll let you go by the judge's order, but know that I'm not fooled about who you are. You might fool the others, but not me." The words were like poison, but Liam didn't respond. He just looked at Mateo being taken away in the ambulance, desperate to be by the boy's side. Outside the courthouse, the ambulance was already ready to leave. The paramedics allowed Liam to get in, though they did it with suspicious looks. He sat by Mateo's side, carefully holding the boy's hand, as if afraid of hurting him further. Mateo was unconscious, but his breathing seemed a little more stable. Liam leaned in and whispered, as if he could somehow reach him. "You're not going to leave me now, Mateo. I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make you well. Just don't give up on me, please." The trip to the hospital was quick, but every second felt like an eternity to Liam. He watched the paramedics working on Mateo, their hands moving with precision and urgency. Every time they exchanged glances or said something to each other, Liam felt his heart tighten, fearing the worst. When they finally arrived at the hospital, Mateo was immediately taken into the emergency room, leaving Liam outside, unable to do anything but wait. Sitting in an uncomfortable chair in the hallway, Liam felt the tears return. He thought about what Mateo had done for him, the sacrifice that young boy had made to defend him. He knew he could never repay it enough, but he would do everything possible to ensure Mateo had a chance to live. The wait was agonizing, but Liam didn't move, determined to be there when Mateo woke up, even as the world around him continued to judge him mercilessly. The silence in the hospital hallway was broken by hurried footsteps and firm voices. 2 police officers emerged, and Liam knew the moment had come. He barely had time to look at the room where Mateo was, still unconscious, before being pulled back. His hands were handcuffed again, and the officer's grip on his arm was so tight it hurt. "You've had enough time here, Liam. It's time to go back to court and face what you deserve." Liam wanted to resist, wanted to shout that he needed to stay with Mateo, but he knew it would be useless. The walk to the police car was quick and cold, and the eyes of the few present in the hospital followed him with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. On the way back, the silence in the vehicle was oppressive. The officer driving said nothing, but the look in the rearview mirror was loaded with contempt. When they arrived at the courthouse, the atmosphere was even heavier than before. The room seemed even more crowded, with all eyes on Liam as he entered. The murmurs grew, but were quickly silenced by the sound of Judge Harold's gavel. Liam was led back to the defendant's bench, his gaze wandering around the room until it found the place where Mateo should have been. Empty. He felt his heart tighten. The boy was fighting for his life, and he was trapped there, powerless. Judge Harold settled into his chair, looking more tense than ever. His usually imposing posture now seemed to waver. He took several deep breaths, as if he were trying to gather the courage to say something that was eating him up inside. When he finally spoke, his voice came out heavy, but with a firmness that made everyone in the room hold their breath. "Before we proceed with sentencing, there's something I need to confess, something I've been carrying with me and can no longer hide." The murmurs began again, but Harold silenced them with a stern look. He rose slowly, his eyes fixed on Liam. I'm the one who killed your father." The impact of those words was like a bomb exploding in the room. People gasped, some stood up, and the prosecutor dropped the papers he was holding. Liam was paralyzed, as if he had been struck by lightning. He stared at Harold, not believing what he had heard. Harold continued, his voice now trembling. "I know everyone here thinks this man, Liam, is guilty of the worst crime, but the truth is, he's been paying for something I did. Years ago, I was in a terrible situation. Despite being a judge, I never knew how to manage my money. My debts were piling up, and I saw no way out. So I made the mistake of borrowing money from Daniel." He paused, running a hand over his face as if trying to push away the weight of the past. He was a ruthless man, and when the time came to pay, I simply had no way to do it. He threatened me, said he would ruin my life, take everything from me. I panicked. I was desperate, and that desperation led me to do something I never imagined myself capable of. I killed him. The words came out as a whisper, but the entire room seemed to hear them with cruel clarity. The prosecutor finally regained his voice, though he was clearly shaken. "This is absurd, Harold. Are you saying you killed Liam's father to save your own skin? And that you hid this while judging his son?" Harold nodded slowly, his eyes now filled with tears. "Yes, and I've lived all this time with that guilt consuming me. I tried to justify it to myself that it was a moment of error, that I had no other choice. But nothing erases what I did. And nothing erases the fact that, because of me, an innocent man is sitting there, accused of something he didn't do." Liam finally found the strength to speak, his voice hoarse and full of pain. "You took everything from me. You destroyed my life, my family, and now you're here expecting that confessing will erase all of that? Do you know what I went through? Do you know what it's like to be hated for something you didn't do? Do you know what it's like to lose everything and still be treated like a monster?" Tears streamed down Liam's face, but his voice was laced with fury and sadness. The judge lowered his head, unable to meet Liam's gaze. "I know that nothing I say or do can correct what I've done, but I can no longer live with this lie. The truth had to come out, even if it means destroying what little is left of me." He turned to the police officers in the room, raising his hands as if surrendering. "I'm ready to pay for what I did. Take me away." The room erupted into chaos. People argued, shouted, some cried. The officers hesitated, looking to the prosecutor for guidance. But the prosecutor stood motionless, still processing what had just happened. Harold looked at Liam one last time, his eyes filled with remorse. "I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't expect you to, but at least now you know the truth." As Harold was led away, the room seemed to sink into a mixture of shock and disbelief. Liam remained seated, his fists clenched, and his mind reeling from the avalanche of revelations. He didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. The truth had finally emerged, bringing with it a whirlwind of new wounds and the hope, however small, of redemption. Months passed slowly, as if time had dragged on since Harold's shocking courtroom confession. The city was still reeling from the revelation. The judge, who had sat in a position of power and authority for so many years, now faced the same justice he had administered in countless other cases. The investigation process was swift. There was enough evidence to incriminate him, including witness testimonies and documents linking Harold to the threats and the crime. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed once again. People wanted to see the conclusion of the story that had shaken not just the city, but the entire judicial system. Harold entered the room handcuffed, his demeanor deflated. He was no longer the imposing man who once commanded that courtroom. His face was pale, and his hunched shoulders showed the weight of remorse and shame. He knew there was no escape, that his mistakes had finally caught up with him. Sitting in the defendant's bench, he couldn't bring himself to look at the faces staring back at him, especially Liam's, who was present, albeit reluctantly. Liam had spent weeks trying to process everything, and now he was there not to seek revenge, but to witness justice being served, something he thought he would never see in his lifetime. The prosecutor began presenting the case with a firmness that made it clear there would be no leniency. "We are here today to address a heinous crime committed by someone who should have been the ultimate example of integrity and justice. Judge Harold not only betrayed his position, but took a man's life to protect his own petty interests." The prosecutor's voice echoed through the room, each word seeming to strike Harold like a blow. He remained silent, his trembling hands resting on the table. Witnesses were called one by one. The first was an old friend of Liam's father, who recounted the threats Harold had received and how he seemed to grow increasingly desperate. He didn't know how to deal with the debts. He tried to ask for help but always came back with the same story, that he was cornered. Daniel was strict, but I never thought it would end in murder. Other witnesses corroborated Harold's increasingly desperate behavior at the time as the room remained silent, absorbing every dark detail of the case. When it was Liam's turn to speak, he stood up with visible hesitation. He looked at Harold, who finally met his gaze. "I spent my entire life being judged for what I didn't do. You called me a monster, condemned me without evidence, and all of that because someone decided to protect their own skin at the cost of my life. I lost everything. My father, my dignity, and even my will to live. There's nothing that can repair what was taken from me, but I'm here because I believe that this time the truth will prevail. Harold destroyed my life, but today he faces the consequences of his own choices." Liam's words brought tears to many eyes in the room, but Harold remained silent, as if each sentence was a punishment he knew he deserved. The presiding judge called for a recess before allowing Harold to make his defense. During the recess, murmurs filled the room, and Liam stepped away to catch his breath. He felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Nothing would bring his father back, but at least the weight of being wrongfully accused was starting to lift. When the trial resumed, Harold stood up and all eyes were fixed on him. His voice was weak but laden with emotion. "I have no excuses for what I did. For years, I tried to justify my actions. But the truth is, I was a coward. I let myself be consumed by my failures, by my inability to deal with life's difficulties, and I chose a path that ruined many lives. I know I can never undo what I did, but I accept what is to come, because I know I deserve it." The prosecutor seized the moment to reinforce his argument. This man had years to confess and never did. He only did so now because he knew he could no longer hide it. He is guilty, and we seek the maximum sentence for this heinous crime. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words were like an anticipated verdict, and everyone in the room seemed to agree. The tension was palpable as the presiding judge weighed the sentence. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the judge declared, "Harold, your actions betrayed not only justice, but the trust of an entire community. You used your position of power to cover up a terrible crime and let an innocent man bear the weight of your guilt. For this, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The sentence was met with silence, followed by murmurs of approval. Harold closed his eyes as if he had finally accepted the fate he had created for himself. As he was led away by the officers, Harold looked at Liam one last time. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but Liam did not respond. He merely watched him being taken away, feeling a mixture of relief and emptiness. The truth had prevailed, but the price had been too high. Outside the courthouse, Liam took a deep breath, looking up at the sky. For the first time in years, he felt as if he could begin to rebuild his life. It wouldn't be easy, and the scars would never disappear, but he was determined to move forward. After all, the justice he had so longed for had finally been served. Liam lay on the hard mattress of the orphanage, enveloped in a heavy silence that seemed to suffocate him. The room was dim, with the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the window, gently illuminating the faces of the other sleeping children around him. But Liam could not rest. His eyes were fixed on the dirty ceiling, but his mind was far away, immersed in confused and painful thoughts about everything that had happened. Even amidst the silence, his mind could not find peace, and the images of his life before arriving there haunted him. He thought of his father, the man who should have protected him, but who instead was the source of all his suffering. His most vivid memories were of screams, the rough touch of his hands and the cruel words he was told throughout his childhood. Liam could not deny that, no matter how much he hated him, a part of him still hoped for something from the man. He hoped, deep down, that someday his father would look at him with compassion, with a minimum of love. But that never happened. The man he feared most was also the only blood tie he had, and that's why the pain was so great. "I never liked him," Liam thought, the words coming out almost like a relief. "But he was my father. I needed him even if he couldn't be what I needed. That's why I told the court that..." But then a more recent thought invaded his mind, something he couldn't get out of his head since the trial. The judge, Harold, the man who had sentenced Liam's father to death. Liam had felt lost when he heard the judge's confession, but over time something began to form within him. The judge set me free, he thought, the words like a revelation. It was hard for him to understand, but somehow that man had been the key to his freedom, even if in a brutal and painful way. He had taken his father out of his life, but in doing so he had also freed him from the clutches of an invisible prison, from the constant threat and fear he had always lived with. It was a contradictory thought, but Liam couldn't help but feel a strange gratitude, something he never imagined he would feel. No matter how much suffering the judge had caused, no matter how tragic his father's death was, it also meant a form of ending. Liam no longer had to fear the man who had mistreated him all his life. Now he could finally be free, although this freedom was accompanied by a painful void, as if he had lost everything. He could no longer count on anyone's protection, but at least there was no longer the weight of the chains that bound him to a past of abuse. The judge, in some way, had ended the cycle of suffering that Liam lived. Tears began to slowly fall from his eyes. He didn't know exactly what he felt. It was a mixture of sadness, anger, and finally a small spark of something he couldn't name. Maybe it was relief, or maybe it was just the end of fear. For years, Liam had lived under his father's shadow, with the constant feeling of being devoured by a relentless beast, never able to escape. Now he found himself free from that prison, but at the same time alone in a world that seemed to have no more room for him. The judge, with his decision, had set him free, but at the same time, he didn't know what to do with that freedom. What was left when everything you knew was destroyed? When you finally realized that the chains you felt maybe weren't the only ones that imprisoned you? The next day, Liam went to the prison. He walked through the cold corridors of the prison, the sound of his boots echoing off the concrete walls. With each step, he felt a weight in his chest, as if the answers he sought were getting farther and farther away, swallowed by the darkness that surrounded the place. He had heard so many versions, so many lies, and still couldn't understand how all of this could have happened. His father was dead, his life turned upside down, and he had no one he could turn to. So when he had the opportunity to see the man responsible for his imprisonment, he knew he should ask the question that tormented him. Judge Harold was sitting in a chair in the interrogation room, his eyes fixed on the void, as if he didn't want to face the boy in front of him. Liam looked at him, feeling a whirlwind of emotions at seeing the man who had such an impact on his life, but he needed to know the truth. He didn't want to live with doubt anymore. Liam took a deep breath before breaking the silence. "How did you leave the gun at the scene without leaving your fingerprints?" he asked, his voice a little shaky but firm. The judge didn't react immediately. He seemed to ponder the answer. Finally, he took a deep breath and spoke in a regretful tone. "I picked it up with a glove," Harold said, looking at Liam with a distant expression, as if remembering that moment. "But at the moment I was about to put it away, a police car stopped on the street. Fear took over me and I dropped the gun. It fell to the ground and I couldn't pick it up anymore. That, Liam, is what saved you from being accused of a crime you didn't commit." Liam was silent for a long time, his words stuck in his throat. Everything the judge said made sense, but at the same time, it seemed even harder to believe. He had come so close to being blamed for something he didn't do. The judge, with his own confession, was giving an explanation that didn't make the weight of the loss less painful, but at least it freed him from a burden he shouldn't have to carry. The pieces were starting to fit together, but Liam felt a mixture of contradictory feelings, as if the truth wasn't enough to erase the pain of everything he had gone through. The relief he felt at finally understanding the situation was tenuous, almost imperceptible in the face of the burning anger within. The following days were a blur in Liam's mind. After his encounter with the judge, he was taken to live with his aunt, a woman who, unlike his mother, had no patience to deal with Liam's pain. She treated him like an intruder, someone who no longer had a place in that world. The new home was like a silent prison, where he was constantly reminded of his condition. He was seen as a bad boy, and any attempt to talk about what had happened with his father or the judge was ignored, as if his words had no value at all. The aunt constantly humiliated him, telling him that he was to blame for everything that had happened, that he was the reason for all the destruction in the lives of those around him. "You won't be able to be anything but a nuisance, Liam," she would always tell him whenever he did something wrong. You're a bad boy, and everyone around you knows it." Liam spent his days in silence, trying not to draw attention, but the daily humiliation corroded him from within. He felt that there was no more space for him in that place. With each cruel remark, each disapproving look, he felt more isolated, more alone. He tried to come to terms with the idea that this would be his new home, but his aunt's words reverberated in his mind like an echo he couldn't escape. He couldn't understand how the people who were supposed to care for him were doing exactly the opposite, making his life even more difficult. Each day became more unbearable until, in a moment of despair, Liam made a decision. He couldn't stay there. He couldn't live under that judgmental and cruel gaze. He needed to escape. In the dead of night, when everyone in the house was asleep, Liam packed his bag with the little he had. He didn't know where he would go, but he knew he couldn't stay any longer. The fear of being caught and taken back to that place where there was no hope motivated him to move forward. Liam left through the back door of the house and ran down the deserted streets aimless, not knowing exactly what he would do with his life. But at that moment, the only thing that mattered was the feeling of freedom, of being free from that oppressive house. He knew that by running away, he would also be running away from his own pain, from the accusations that never ceased, from the shame that consumed him. He ran until his muscles ached, until his breathing became irregular and his body weakened. But he didn't stop. Liam knew that if he went back, the humiliations would be even worse. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined not to return to that place. He was running away from everything that held him back, running away from a life he never wanted for himself, and as he ran through the empty streets, a persistent thought formed in his mind. He would no longer be a prisoner. He knew he needed to find himself, but he also knew that his search for freedom was just beginning. Liam walked the dark streets, the cold of the night coiling around him, while his stomach growled with hunger. He was already used to the feeling of emptiness, but that night seemed different. Loneliness was his companion, and he wondered if things would ever be different, if he would have a place where he could rest without fear of being kicked out, where he could eat until he was full. He had nowhere to go, no one to cling to. The world seemed vast and immense, but he felt that there was no space for him. It was then that he saw him. Matteo was sitting in a corner of the street, his face dirty and his eyes lost. Liam recognized the pain in Matteo's eyes, a pain he knew so well himself. He approached, hesitant at first, but soon Matteo looked at him, and a sad smile appeared on his face. It wasn't a smile of happiness, but rather of recognition. They were both in the same situation, both deprived of everything but still existing, surviving, facing what the world threw in their faces. "Are you here too?" Matteo asked, his voice hoarse, but full of a kind of silent understanding. Liam just nodded, not knowing what to say. The conversation seemed unnecessary, for the words they exchanged didn't need explanation. They already knew what it meant to be there on the street, with nothing, with no one. Both had lost so much. Liam sat down next to Matteo, and for a while the two remained silent, looking at the distant stars as if waiting for something that would never come. The following days were a tiresome repetition, looking for food, finding improvised shelter, fleeing from unwanted glances. They were always hungry, always cold, but at least they weren't alone. Liam and Matteo, even in misery, had found a form of friendship in adversity. But this life, harsh and without prospects, seemed eternal. Hope was a distant concept, something they knew they were no longer entitled to. Even so, they supported each other, sharing the little food they could find, the small things that made life bearable. But then, one day, something unexpected happened. A woman approached them as they were resting in a corner of the square. She had a kind look, but at the same time seemed burdened by a deep sadness. Liam watched her suspiciously, still unable to believe that someone could care about them. "You two," she began, her voice soft but full of firmness, "are suffering, and I know your life shouldn't be like this. I'm Judge Harold's wife, and I know what he did to you, to your father, and to everyone around you. But I want you to know that it doesn't define who he is. I wanted to apologize for everything that happened. Please accept an opportunity to start over." Liam remained silent, trying to process the words. The woman before him was no ordinary figure. She was Harold's wife, the man who had destroyed his life. Liam felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could someone so close to Harold have the audacity to apologize after everything that happened? But at the same time, something in her voice made him feel lost. He didn't know what to think or feel. Mateo, who was by his side, looked at Liam with an expression he couldn't interpret, but Liam knew the decision was his. And at that moment, he felt he no longer had the strength to fight against the world. Perhaps it was a second chance. Perhaps it was the only chance he would have to escape that endless cycle of suffering. "I accept," Liam said, his voice trembling but determined. "But don't ask me to forget." The woman smiled sadly. "It's not about forgetting, dear. It's about trying to rebuild what was broken." Life at Judge Harold's wife's house wasn't easy. Liam felt out of place, even though he was now living in a home that seemed stable, but his wounds were too deep to be healed so quickly. Mateo was also there, but he seemed more distant, more closed off in his own thoughts. Liam knew they were just surviving, not really living, but something, however small inside him, told him that it might be possible to start over. The day of the visit to Harold in prison came without warning. Liam didn't know what to expect. He had heard so many stories, so many explanations and excuses, but nothing seemed to make sense. He found himself inside a cold room with the imposing walls around him, facing the man who had changed his life forever. Harold was older, more haggard, as if the weight of his own conscience had left deep marks. When Liam entered the visitor's room, the judge's gaze fixed on him with a mix of remorse and pain. "I know you hate me," said Harold, his voice muffled by the prison, "and you have every right to hate me. What I did was unforgivable. But please, the only thing I can do now is apologize." "I'm sorry, Liam." Liam looked at the judge, the man who had made him lose his life but who had also set him free in a way. He felt a growing anger, but something stronger prevented him from exploding. He took a deep breath before answering, his words heavy. "I would be dead if you hadn't done anything, Judge," Liam said with a tone of disdain but also a bitter understanding. "You didn't set me free. You killed me, but at least by letting me live, you gave me a chance to find something, to find some reason to keep going." Harold didn't respond immediately. He seemed to swallow the words, feeling the weight of the truth Liam had just thrown in his face. He knew that nothing could justify what he had done, but still, something in Liam's words seemed to be a reflection of his own misery. The silence between them stretched, heavy and unbearable. They both knew that nothing could change the past, but perhaps in that cold room, they could understand that life, with all its mistakes and pains, would go on. Liam didn't expect forgiveness, and maybe he would never accept it. But the truth, he told himself, was clear. He had survived, and as painful as it was, that was all he had. Liam and Mateo spent the following years on an arduous path, but alongside people who truly cared for them, in an environment that, despite everything, offered some hope. Harold's wife, knowing their pain, treated them with respect and affection, without rushing to erase the past, but also without ignoring it. She knew that forgiveness didn't happen overnight, and that the rebuilding would be slow, but she was willing to help them take that step. Over time, Liam found comfort in small things. He learned to take care of himself, to trust people again, and most importantly, he learned to forgive himself. It wasn't about forgetting what the judge had done, but about releasing the weight he carried within himself, the weight of anger and guilt. Mateo also found his space. Together, they formed an unlikely but real family. Life, as always, was not easy, but now they had a future. Liam and Mateo enrolled in an education program for at-risk youth and began to learn, to study, and gradually to move away from the street. Liam discovered he was good with words, someone capable of telling his story in a way that touched people's hearts. He decided to pursue his dream of becoming a writer, using pain and experience to create something new. Mateo, in turn, fell in love with music, and the house that once seemed cold and lifeless now filled with sounds, laughter, and stories. Harold's wife helped them get established, not only financially, but emotionally. She taught them about the value of patience, compassion, and forgiveness, and slowly Liam began to see life differently. Not as a game of revenge, but as a journey of self-discovery. He finally felt worthy of a better future. On a mild winter, a few years later, Liam received a letter. It was from Judge Harold, now serving his sentence in prison. In the letter, he expressed remorse, but also something Liam didn't expect: a sincere apology and a thank you for giving him the chance to reflect on his own life. He acknowledged his mistakes and wanted at least to know that Liam had found some peace. Liam looked at the letter for a moment, feeling a mixture of emotions, but instead of anger, what he felt was a kind of liberation. He had survived hell, and now he was at peace with himself. He kept the letter in a box, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even in the midst of suffering, there was room for transformation. Years passed, and Liam became a respected writer, telling his story and Mateo's. They opened a community center for at-risk youth, offering others what they had once found: the chance to start over. Although the past was still there, in the form of memories and scars, life was now different. It was full of love, friendship, and above all, hope. Liam looked at Mateo, smiling. They had survived the worst, and now side by side they knew that the best was yet to come. If Harold and Liam's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and check out the story that's appearing on the screen now, specially chosen for you. See you soon.